Senator Kelly. So Representative Candelora, if you want to get started.
Thank you, Brian, and good afternoon, everybody. As you all know, I'm Vincent Candelora, House Republican leader, and we're holding this press conference to talk about the governor's budget address today. While I appreciate the attempts to find efficiencies in government, specifically sort of modernizing our DMV with the licensure process, I think Connecticut residents will find that a welcome addition. I think it certainly does lack some enthusiasm, what we're seeing. This budget reads sort of as a multiple choice quiz, where the governor has given the legislature the choice of closing the budget deficit by either choosing economic growth, federal funding, or use of the rainy day fund. And I find that a bit disappointing that we don't see more specifics being offered with such a significant portion of our budget deficit. We have had about $17 billion of federal money infused into the state of Connecticut over the last year, whether it was direct subsidies to the state, PPP, or unemployment benefits. And there is no question that that money has helped prop up the state of Connecticut and has given us the time to plan a new direction for our state. And I believe what this budget is merely doing is sort of taking that money and putting it into different silos and pots without bold policies to address issues, such as our education achievement gap that is only growing wider with our cities and towns having a very multiple array of how they're providing education to our children. Some people have learned in isolation for the last year. Others have been in person almost the entire time of the pandemic. And I believe that while putting money into education is important, we need to see the policies behind that that will provide a pathway to close the achievement gap for our children.
In no uncertain terms, that the march from the ellipse was not permitted. It was not until after President Trump and his team became involved in the planning that the march from the ellipse to
Okay, thank you, Brian. Additionally, what we've seen in this budget is a 25% decrease in revenues throughout this pandemic. While that 25% reduction has been acknowledged by the governor, it doesn't really peel back the true story of how Main Street has been devastated by this pandemic, our restaurants, our hospitality industries, and at the same time, we've seen record gains in our Wall Street. What we need in this budget, I think, is more programming to prop up these industries that have been devastated, whether we do it through the federal CARES Act money or we do it through state programming. I think we need to address those issues going forward. And so overall, while I appreciate the proposals that have been put forth that are finding efficiencies for the state of Connecticut, I think we do need a better, bolder policy changes that will put Connecticut on a better path. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Vin, and thank you all for being with us this afternoon. It is an important day in Connecticut whenever the governor speaks and delivers a budget. I find it very interesting that he talks about a Connecticut comeback that, quite frankly, for the middle class is 12 years in the making. It's a Connecticut economy that's been dominated by the Democrats that has landed the middle class of Connecticut in dead last with regards to personal income growth and job growth. And this is by no means a blueprint forward. What we see here is I'm going to use the term loosely, budget, because it is not, in my opinion, responsible. The governor did not do the job that he's required to under the Constitution by providing a balanced budget where you can identify and point to exact revenue stream. As Representative Candelora pointed out, and you'll see in the budget, we're looking at either a better economy. He's hoping for a better economy than one we had before COVID, as if for some reason during this pandemic, the dynamics in the economy of Connecticut have improved. We're also going to rely on a bonus or a bailout from the federal government, or if necessary, to look to the rainy day fund, which quite frankly is a very useful tool. It's a benefit that we have that is the byproduct of the bipartisan budget and Republican initiatives that were placed into that budget. The Republican initiatives of the rainy day fund, the spending cap, the bonding cap have made Connecticut much more safe from a financial perspective than most states. And yet we're going to be looking at going there. The next point that I think is problematic is that there is no relief from a tax perspective for the middle class. Quite frankly, there are a number of initiatives here, like the gas tax for climate initiatives, but the sacrifice that Connecticut middle class families are going to make, the 17 cents a gallon to start, it's only going to go up from there, is going to benefit communities to our east, which is basically the state of Rhode Island and the Atlantic Ocean. And unless we get the states from our west, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Tennessee Valley, unless we get those communities to do the same, the sacrifice that the middle class is going to make for this is just not going to reward them with the benefits of cleaner air. We'd like to see our Washington delegation go and get those states to our west to agree with what Connecticut's doing if we're going to go down this road. I also believe there's a better way to get to the same place. We can do that either by unclogging congestion on our major highways or by doing green initiatives with regards to open space. We also have a tax on trucks. And let's be clear on this one. This is going to affect trucks because it's based on weight, not just tractor trailer trucks coming from other parts in the United States. It's going to hit trucks that start and finish their routes, like home heating oil trucks, and place that burden and that cost squarely on the middle class kitchen table. At a time when Connecticut families need help, this is a bill they're going to get. Lastly, they're talking about taxes on health insurance premiums, as if the family health insurance premium isn't enough while it rivals a mortgage payment. These are just not good common sense, reasonable solutions for middle class families that are really, really struggling under this COVID economy. And yet there's also legislative initiatives like the mansion tax that's defined at $400,000, or even the $4 billion tax proposal that the Democrats have made last week. Lastly, I think one of the most unacceptable parts of the governor's budget is the ECS formula. Freezing the numbers at this year's amount when you have surplus funds coming from the federal government. In other words, Connecticut's going to have more funds than what we would have called for under the ECS formula. The governor's budget is going to shortchange some communities. And let me just remind everyone that ECS formula, another initiative that came out of that bipartisan budget that was insisted upon by Republicans, because it was then going to change the formula from a political decision to one based on fairness, equity, and need, the needs and educational needs of Connecticut's children. This budget will leave Connecticut children behind and turn back the hands of time to when decisions for education are based on political whims, not on the needs of our future. And that is what brought us to a position where we have the achievement gap. So from those perspectives, I think this budget starts to erode the spirit of that bipartisan budget, and it doesn't show a better way for Connecticut's middle class. With that, I'll leave it for questions.
Okay, everyone. If again, if you have a question, please either raise your hand or make a note in the chat box, and we'll take them in order in which they came. So we'll start with Sue Haig, and then we'll move to Christine Stewart after that. So Sue, let me see if I can unmute you. Hang on a moment.
I think I did it.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking my question. The governor today said that defeating COVID was the top of his priority. He talked about rolling out testing, some more vaccinations, increasing rates for nursing homes. I wondered, is this a big enough response to COVID? I know, Vinny, you just mentioned, there's still businesses, Main Street businesses that are hurting. What is missing from this package? Because this is the first big response to COVID that we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the COVID itself, which I would say what's missing from the package is support to our local health districts on how we're rolling out the vaccine. I know the supplies are coming in slow, but I have to say there's a lot of frustration and confusion that is being handed down at the state level. We should be looking at, and I'd like to know what kind of funding is being infused into these health districts that are left responsible for administering these vaccines. At the granular level, we have health districts that are seeking volunteers that are coming in and administering the vaccines for people. We have towns that are supplying the food for these volunteers. Where is the funding to prop that up? The second piece is all the collateral issues. My biggest concern right now, aside, of course, from the economy, is our educational system. We have had children that have been learning in isolation for an entire year. We need planning, and that planning needs to start now for summer school, for programs to try to get these kids caught up. The achievement gap used to be limited to our cities, and that is no longer the case. It now could be in the rural communities that don't have internet access. It could be in the suburbs that have had distance learning with minimal instruction. We just don't know, because on a statewide level, we left up those individual decisions to the towns. And so I think we need to assess very quickly and put that money toward programs that are going to get our kids jump started. I found it a little distressing that we're going to take $400 million and throw it into the ECS formula and claim victory. We need much more granular proposals coming out of our State Department of Education for these children.
And Senator, is there anything that you would have liked to have seen regarding COVID in this budget?
Well, I think not only, obviously, the COVID pandemic is the single biggest issue of the day. I would have also liked, I think part of this has to also look at what are the effects, all the things that Vin had just said, but also the effects both with mental health and in families, as well as just the social isolation of seniors in nursing homes. And we need to address that issue and to make sure that we come out of this with a patient-centered care model that focuses on the seniors, not everyone around them, whether it's medical providers or labor and institutions, but actually looks at the individuals themselves.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, next we'll move to Christine Stewart. Go ahead, Christine.
Thanks, Brian. So my question is, this is a fairly conservative budget. There are no broad-based tax increases in here. It does use federal funding. It assumes some federal funding to close the gap. So what is there not to like for Republicans?
Well, I think it undoes some fiscal policies that were important to Republicans. It does not budget the gap, which was significant. It is re-amortizing our state employment retirement. I think it adds on 3 additional years. It moves in a significant amount of lapses from this year into next year, which is going to create a major spending cap issue 2 years out. So I think there's a lot of those type of bad fiscal policies Not to mention, as Senator Kelly pointed out, 40% of the budget deficit is left into question. And one of those options on the table is to drain the rainy day fund, which was a critical initiative of the Republicans. So I don't know what I call this budget. I wouldn't call it really a conservative budget or a liberal budget. It's sort of a mediocre budget that is safe and provides multiple choice options for the legislature to deal with.
Yeah, and
Thank you.
I would agree with that assessment in that, you're looking at, this is not how you would plan a family budget. You don't sit there and say, oh, well, I can go and plan to spend this amount of money because I'm going to get another stimulus check from Washington, and it's going to be, $1.7 billion. You wouldn't also go out and say, well, you know what? I can go ahead and do these things because the economy is going to get better and I'm going to get a raise next year. That's not how Connecticut families operate. And certainly by extension, their legislature shouldn't be the same way. And that's where it's a concern, because if the economy doesn't turn around and let's be mindful, be better than where we were before the pandemic, and if we don't get the federal money out of Washington, then the only thing you're left with is raiding the rainy day fund. That's what you're left with to plug a budget hole that is created in its design. So that's what I think the issue is, that we're behaving not the same way our constituents. I shouldn't say we. This is what the governor's budget is.
Is there any Republican support for legalizing cannabis?
Well, I think the devil is always in the details on that issue. Certainly, we had support years ago when we had homegrown policies and the libertarian sort of belief that people should be allowed to grow the plant in their households. It's now morphed into a social justice proposal that is diverting substantial amounts of money into cities, giving priority to certain people to be able to get the license. And it's become sort of a commercialized enterprise. And that's complicated the debate and not made it, not just for Republicans, but for Democrats too. And I think that's why that proposal's never been able to move forward over the last 6 years, despite the fact that the Democrats have had majorities.
Yeah, I think you see support and opposition on both sides of the aisle.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. We've got Frankie Graziano from Connecticut Public Radio. And then so you are in the queue after that, we've got Ebong Udoma, Anna Elizabeth, and Dan Har. And just a reminder, if you have a question, please either raise your hand or drop something in the chat box. So Frankie, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Christine just essentially asked the question on legalized cannabis, but is there concern that because of the majority and how things shake out, that now that you see it in the budget, Democrats can essentially push through marijuana? What do you think, Speaker Candelora?
Well, I think one of my concerns is that we see an excise tax on top of a 3% municipal tax. One of the governor's main policies for pushing commercialized marijuana is to push out the black market. But Connecticut is pricing marijuana and putting roughly 10% taxes on it, that it's actually going to encourage the black market to come into Connecticut, because the marijuana industry under these regulations are going to produce a much more expensive product than what the black market will provide. Additionally, the amount of state resources that they have in the budget that is going toward this program up front is concerning to me and is misplaced. And frankly, that money could go toward COVID relief.
Thank you.
Okay, up next is Ebong from WSHU Radio. Ebong, are you
Hello?
there?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. To follow up on the marijuana, is there a chance that it will finally pass this year? What do you guys think about that? And secondly, the tolls on trucks, is there a chance that will pass this year?
Okay. First, obviously, you know, it's in the governor's budget with regards to marijuana. It's in the governor's budget. It's obviously initiative that he's in favor of, and you know, it's always been discussed. I think you've got opponents and proponents, people who like it and don't like it on both sides of the aisle. I don't think it's clearly a partisan issue. I think there's reasons why you wouldn't support that. You know, I don't think the justification that just because every other state around us and everyone else is doing it, that we should do it. I mean, after all, isn't that what our moms told us, is that just because it doesn't mean you should do it? And I haven't heard any conversation that this is good from a science perspective, that it's good for our youth or it's good from a health perspective, which is what we've been guided for with during not only COVID, but also when you hear about the flavored tobaccos being accessible to our youth. So I think there's some inconsistencies there, and I think we're going to have a healthy conversation and debate. From what I understand with regards to tolls, those don't appear to be on the agenda, but you do have two other initiatives that are fairly regressive and onerous for middle class families, and that is the mileage tax, which is going to tax the weight of trucks that emanate from Connecticut and return to work in Connecticut. So they're just trucks that drive around our state based on weight. They're going to be taxed, and that's going to be borne by the middle class, as well as the gas tax for the TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative. And I think there's a better way to get to clean air without a gas tax, without burdening middle class. And that's a very regressive tax, because the less money you earn, the harder and the bigger that bite is out of your family budget. And so I know that they're out there and they're looking at other ways to solve this transportation issue.
Well, it's called a fee now, but bottom line, it's the same thing. So it failed the last time. What are the chances this time?
I think you're still going to run into the same issues, is that it's going to be burdensome on the middle class. I think they're trying to change the dynamic to say it's only going to be limited to the weight of trucks, or that the purpose here is to benefit the environment. And I think that number one is that the sacrifice that's going to be made by Connecticut residents without anybody from our west doing the same thing means that we're not going to get a return on our investment. And number two, there are other ways to do this that are not regressive tax based.
The only other thing that I'd like to add is that they want to use this as a leverage to get more federal aid. So what happens to the federal aid if we don't get the fees passed this year?
Which
I think generally, yeah. I mean, generally, the Special Transportation Fund needs to show solvency over 5 years in order to get federal aid. So you are correct in that there needs to be something proposed, whether it's this type of an initiative or something else. But I think right now what we are going to hear from the trucking industry is that the classes of vehicles that it's going to hit will be the very people that are hurting the most with the lack of construction right now due to transportation. So I think that these discussions are going to be borne out over the next couple of months. And we would love to see these proposals. I'm concerned that the governor was very light on how they are going to enforce and administer this program. When you're talking about mileage taxes, how are you going to be able to collect that tax and track all of these truck vehicles going throughout the entire state of Connecticut? So I just think we have to hear a lot more from the governor's office of the feasibility of that proposal before we even consider it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, up next is Anna Elizabeth from the CT Examiner, followed by Dan Haar, John Craven, then Susan Raff. Go ahead, Anna.
Hey, thank you. Gonna mix things up with yet another question about legalized marijuana. But I am just curious if you could share a little more about where you would prefer to see cannabis tax revenue directed, and whether you think that if it had lower taxes or if it were less regulated, like for example, by allowing homegrown marijuana, whether that type of proposal would be more likely to garner Republican support.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally, to me, the commercialized market has always been a big concern for me. This is not about legalizing a product, it's about commercializing a product. People already have wide access to alcohol and tobacco, and do we want to add another product that is devastating to people's health, especially to children? And so I would be more inclined to support proposals like a homegrown product. As Senator Kelly points out, we're right now debating the impacts of the flavored vape products that we're seeing being marketed to children. Well, this commercialized proposal is going to be inserting gummy bears and cookies and sodas and all sorts of flavored marijuana products into the state of Connecticut. That is going to have the same impact that we've seen that vape nicotine products have had on our children. So those are certainly my concerns. And I think Vermont models that provide the homegrown method respects people's right to be able to smoke marijuana if they want to, but it doesn't commercialize the product. So you're actually marketing this to children or even to young adults who you want to keep on. You know, additionally, the THC limits right now are at 90% when you look at the commercialized products. With homegrown, you wouldn't see that kind of potent marijuana product that leads to the psychosis and all the other issues. So I think that it would garner more support if it went in that direction and didn't become a revenue conversation the way the governor's budget makes it all about revenue.
Thank you.
Okay, Anna, if you're all set, I'm assuming you are, we will move on next to Dan Haar. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, guys. Thanks for doing this. I want to pick up on the revenues. You sound, just as the Democratic governor sounds a little bit like a Republican, you guys are sounding a little bit like Democrats, which is great to see a bipartisan approach. And so I would ask you, in respect to the various forms of additional needs that you've outlined, how, and assuming that you would not believe, that you do not believe it's responsible to use the federal stimulus that has not yet passed, how would you pay for these programs? And if it's through cuts, what would you cut?
That is the $1 million question. And so fortunately, we do have a process where we have up through April for the legislature to sort of dissect this and understand where we are. I'm still trying to understand this, which seemed to account for a $4 billion deficit, while our revenues are at $2.6 billion. So really having to get our arms around that first. I think some of the spending cuts that the governor put into his budget are certainly worthwhile. And I think that, you know, those questions are going to be answered as we move through the process.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Senator.
I was just going to say, the actual details are what we have to look at and have the opportunity to review. We've only received those this morning. And so, once we have an opportunity to really review this process and see where the governor's, actual, I'm going to say, go more onto the minutia, then we'd be in a better position to tell you what we think is real revenue, what's not, and where we would make policy difference, changes accordingly. But I think just when you look at like ECS, for instance, if you're going to take that federal money that we already have in-house, the $440 million, he's moving forward, not following the ECS formula. So, and we have more money from the federal government than the state would have put in under the planned ECS formula. So I think what we would do, or at least I would do, is to make sure that no community and no child in Connecticut is left behind. I wouldn't take a policy, change a policy that was actually founded in and came out of fairness, equity, and need, and not disturb that formula. Make sure that every needy kid in the state of Connecticut gets the constitutional education that they have a right to. And then with the surplus funds, look at building in additional enhancements to maybe some of the school districts and communities that need a little extra help, but by no means leaving someone behind. So that's a difference that I would have done just off the top, the 30,000 foot level, looking at what this budget's doing.
Right. I think I wrote this morning that policy is precisely what you just said, using the federal stimulus money to plug a budget gap rather than to assist towns. But again, I would, if you're proposing to do additional spending with that federal money and or to not plug the budget gap, are you, it sounds like, at least in past years, you've been committed to no broad-based tax increases. So I would just wonder where the revenue might come from, even broadly, setting aside the narrow pieces of here versus there, just in broad categories, where might the revenue come from?
Well, and I think that's where, broadly right now, we do have a lot of federal CARES Act money that's come in this last tranche that has been incorporated into this budget, along with a significant amount of lapses that were moved into fiscal year 2022. So as we're unpeeling all of that, I'm not sure to what degree we would need new revenue in the first year. And so we really have to unpeel that onion before we start making specific proposals. And right now, today, what we're doing is examining the governor's budget and, of course, picking that apart, which is probably the easiest task that we have this session. But I think globally, or one of my general takeaways from this budget, my concern is that I don't think it really is laser focused enough on the collateral issues of our pandemic, specifically in terms of education and vaccine rollout.
And Dan, just I want to be clear on this. What I'm referring to is the federal money we have already received from Washington for education. And the governor has decided to depart from the ECS formula. Now, the rest of the budget is I'm going to say, relying on a future federal bailout that may come. And that's a different conversation. But what I'm looking at here with the ECS example is that money we already have, and Connecticut can distribute that. And I would have hoped that that distribution would have been consistent with the ECS formula, because that formula was based on court cases that focused on fairness, equity, and need. And
right, I was agreeing with you, yes.
Right, okay.
Right,
good. Just wanted to make sure we're
right.
Clear.
Thank you.
Okay, moving along, we've got John Craven, followed by Susan Raff.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, Vinny, you put out a statement earlier saying that this budget really fails to inspire. But all in all, I mean, for you guys having a Democrat governor, this seems like it's not so bad for you guys.
Well, it depends what your metric is. If your metric is how much of new taxes is in the budget, historically, I think you might be able to say that. The issue that I take is that, again, we are in the middle of a pandemic, that this governor for the past 8 months has largely been in charge with navigating and steering through the pandemic. We've seen press conference after press conference every single day of setting the tone and telling us how things are going. This budget is our first sort of ability to pull the curtain back on what has been going over the last year and how we are going to move forward as a state. And what I don't see in this budget is the bold new proposals that we need to get out of this pandemic. Specifically, when you talk anecdotally from town to town, we hear about the very different educational delivery systems that have been provided to our students. We hear about children who have not been enrolled in schools. Part of the issue with the ECS funding and why they froze the formula is because 16,000 kids have not enrolled in schools. Well, where are they? Are they in our cities? And that's why we froze it, to keep them whole. But the most important thing is, where are these children? And so that is data that really, I'm sure they are collecting, and we should be responding to. How many children are distance learning? I think it's upward of 60% probably. We don't know that. We don't have access to that information. And that's what I was hoping to see in this budget, is specifics on what programs we're going to put forth throughout the summertime to catch all these children up. And I don't see that. Looking forward on the vaccine rollout, I still don't know how much money my health district is getting to administer the vaccines in the 5 towns that they are in charge of in this pandemic. And we're being told that they've been given money directly from the feds, yet our local communities are getting volunteers to make lunch and dinner for these people, and they're advertising to get people trained to administer the vaccines. So all of these questions, I think, should have been addressed through this budget, and we should be focusing on it. And so, yes, I think from a bland tax perspective, we could say this might be okay for Republicans, but where we are today in this pandemic, I have a lot of concerns with this proposal.
So does that mean that you guys are going to come out with your own budget proposal?
Well, and I think, getting to that point, we certainly are one of the only minority parties in the country that have continued to put out budget after budget. And we take a look at that. But I think most importantly, I want to see a governor come to the table and want to have true bipartisan conversation. Last year, when the Senate Republicans put forth a transportation alternative, it was summarily dismissed within 10 minutes of it being released. When Republicans came forward with a paid family leave alternative, it was summarily dismissed. When Republicans came forward with alternatives for the police accountability proposal in July, that too was rejected, and the governor signed the Democrats' bill into law. Coming forward into this new leadership with Senator Kelly and myself, we had offered some mitigation to the executive order proposals, which were also summarily dismissed. Yet 3 days after the dismissal, one of our 5 points was incorporated by the governor. We also proposed a restaurant relief fund in December that the governor summarily dismissed and then proposed his own. So we've seen a pattern over the last 2 years of a lack of bipartisan cooperation. And so what we would like to see is that olive branch of true cooperative bipartisan relationship from the executive branch before we're going to move forward with any budget proposals.
And just one last question for you guys. And I apologize if this was asked earlier. I had to hop on late. In terms of this mileage fee, mileage tax, whatever you want to call it, the Democrats didn't have the votes for trucks only tolls last year. How do you view this? I mean, do you view it as the same thing, or is it something different as they're claiming?
Well, clearly it's a tax, it's a regressive tax, and it's ultimately going to be borne by the middle class. Because what's going to happen is it goes right into the goods and services. If I'm the weight of my truck to deliver home oil falls under the mileage tax, I'm going to pass that on in the service and the product that I'm selling to middle class Connecticut. And so that's going to be borne by the taxpayers. It gets pushed on at a time that Connecticut is unaffordable. We're coming in, and the governor's coming in with a budget that's going to tax the middle class and take money out of their budget and use it. And this is, once again, if you're at the lower end of the economic scale and you don't have you don't have a high hourly wage, this is going to take a bigger bite out of your family budget than it is of people that live at the top of the economic scale. So I think it's regressive, and it's squarely targeted to the middle class.
Do you consider it another version of a toll?
Well, it's a toll of a different color, in the sense that, instead of tolling cars as they ride on 95, it's now looking at kind of the same argument. This is where the Democrats started last time, that we're only going to toll trucks, and we're only going to toll them at the borders. And so now there's a mileage tax on trucks, the way that trucks only. It's the same conversation again, and we're going to also have a gas tax. Once again, the gas tax is another aggressive tax that's going to hit the middle class and people with lower hourly wage jobs a lot harder than people earning six figures. And that's not fair.
Okay, John, if you're all set, we'll move on to Susan Raff. And after Susan, I know Frankie Graziano from Connecticut Public Radio had a follow-up question, but if there's anyone else who had a question, I'll go to you, give you a chance before we go back to Frankie for a second shot. So please raise your hand or drop a note in the chat box. So Susan, go ahead.
Thank you. Not to be too simplistic, because I got to run, be on air, but I wanted just to kind of circle back with Vinny to kind of encapsulate, while you feel that the governor's backing off from any broad-based tax increases is a good thing. There's more in that budget that you feel needs to be addressed. And you talked about two things. One, you feel that education, because of the pandemic, that cities and towns may need more money for that, and also the health districts. What else is in this budget that you feel Republicans really can't digest or live with?
Well, and I think that as what was just discussed, the transportation proposal, understanding that user fee and how it actually could be administered. I don't think that was really well fleshed out. There are a lot of union savings that are in this budget that they would need another agreement. So what would that look like? I think there are a lot of questions like that throughout the budget. There are some good agency proposals and savings, that we certainly could support. But I think those are just the quick read that we've gotten over the last couple hours. Those are sort of some of the questions I think that we will need answers going forward.
Right, and the mileage based tax or fee is not new. That was talked about, I think, a couple of years ago. I remember doing stories on that, but it was kind of pushed aside, maybe because the Democrats thought that tolls would have a shot. But now tolls are not here, and our transportation fund needs money. Right?
Well, and that's right. But I think that certainly we need to get more details. Even the TCI proposal that will translate into a gas tax is going to be a regional organization made up of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Washington, D.C., that's going to be voting on proposals and telling us how we're going to spend that money that is certainly needed for the transportation fund. And I think the governor's budget has like a $90 million earmark per year for the gas mileage tax. But I don't see how that makes up the rest of the deficiencies in the transportation fund that budget, I think, identified as $1 billion. So we still have a lot of questions to answer. And I think that proposal wasn't as cooked as I expected it to be in the budget.
Thanks, Vinny. It's a bad recipe.
Yes.
Next, go to Mark at the Yankee Institute, followed by Frankie, who had a question on sports betting. So go ahead, Mark.
Hi, thank you, Senator Kelly and Representative Canalora. I have a question. A large chunk of savings seems to come from delaying sales tax transfer to the municipal revenue savings account. How is that going to affect municipalities, especially when the governor's saying that municipal aid is going to be kept whole?
Yeah, so it's a freeze of the MRSA money. It's about $370 million. That money has always been promised to our municipalities, and the state has never delivered on that promise. So it's not a cut to our towns and cities because they never received that money. It just represents another broken promise.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Frankie Graziano from Connecticut Public Radio on sports betting, I believe. Frankie, are you there? Unmute if you can. Okay, looks like maybe Frankie's having some problems. Unless anyone else has a question, I guess we'll call it a day. We appreciate you coming, and Frankie, if you want to connect with us offline to ask your follow-up, we can do that. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.